In this video, I will cover the history of Pakistan or the history of Islam in Pakistan from 1947 to roughly till now. So this is mainly about how Islam has fared in Pakistan, especially Islamic modernism, and how ulama, Islamists and others have interacted with the state and provided challenges to it. Before this, I have covered history of Islam in Indian subcontinent before partition in the previous video. And I will do all this through the second chapter of the book Islam in Pakistan, and that chapter is Modernism and its ethical commitments. And this video is also structured according to the sections of the chapter, which are 4, and the second section has 3 subsections. So let's start. After Pakistan's political instability and the breakup of the country in 1971, it is easy to forget how much excitement and hope the creation of Pakistan originally generated among many of its people. So we will look at the main stages of Pakistan's political history and see how modernism has functioned within that history. This chapter of the book highlights the ambiguities and contradictions in modernist thought. Although modernists often spoke in the language of freedom and justice, they were frequently connected with authoritarian governments. This was partly because they wanted rapid top-down reform, partly because they believed traditionalist and Islamist authoritarianism could only be defeated by strong rule, and partly because many rulers themselves had modernist leanings. However, apart from this strategy, there was also an authoritarian tendency within modernist thinking itself. So let's start with the first years of Pakistan. In February 1948, speaking to Americans, Muhammad Ali Jinnah said that Pakistan would not be a theocratic state ruled by priests. He stressed that Hindus, Christians, Parsis and others were equal citizens. In his very first speech as the President of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan, he had offered similar assurances that religion, caste and creed should not matter in state affairs, and that all would be simply citizens of Pakistan, which is indeed a very different language from the one he used for making the case for Pakistan. These words came at a time of terrible violence during partition, when hundreds of thousands were killed and about 12 million people were displaced. So Jinnah's message was meant to calm fears. Still, he continued to use Islamic language. In October 1947 in Lahore, he said victory would come if people took inspiration from the Quran. And in early 1948, he criticized those who claimed Pakistan's constitution would not be based on the Sharia. What Jinnah seems to have meant by the Sharia was what the British in India had meant by it, that the Muslim laws of personal status governing matters such as marriage, divorce and inheritance, and not a full Islamic legal system as Islamists like Maududi wanted. After him, modernist Muslim leaders continued to speak in Islamic language. A key moment came in March 1949 when Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan introduced the famous Objectives Resolution. It declared that sovereignty belongs to God, but that the people of Pakistan would exercise authority as a sacred trust. It promised democracy, freedom, equality, tolerance and social justice as enunciated by Islam, guaranteed rights to minorities and said Muslims would be enabled to live according to Quran and Sunnah. But this document was full of ambiguity. It was not clear how God's sovereignty worked in practice, how Islamic guidance would affect non-Muslims or who would interpret Islam. Modernists were not worried. They believed Islam naturally supported liberal values, so linking the state to Islam only strengthened democracy and ethics. Others were uneasy too. The ulama did not want modernists to shape Islam and politics without their supervision, while secular Muslims warned against mixing religion and the state. Non-Muslim minorities, especially Hindus, feared becoming second-class citizens. Some ulama had already told Hindu leaders that a non-Muslim could not head a Muslim state. During constitutional debates, Hindu members strongly criticized Islamic clauses. In 1953, during debate on the Basic Principles Committee report, they questioned the setting up of an organization to spread Islamic teachings, which they saw as a state-sponsored proselytizing. At the same time, modernists themselves were unsure about how Islam should be interpreted. They said true Islam was ethical and just, unlike the flawed behavior of Muslims in history, but this left unanswered the question of why Muslims would be able to follow proper Islam now if they had failed to do so for much of their history. The modernist thinker Khalifa Abdul Hakim argued that only in modern times had humanity matured enough to apply Islam properly, which actually seemed more indebted to the Hegelian march of history than to the study of the Muslim past. A deeper issue was who had authority to define Islam, modernists or ulama. The BPC report had envisioned a board of 5 people well versed in Islamic laws to advise the president and the provincial governors on whether any new legislation contravened the Quran and the Sunnah, which raised fears of a mullah board, a pejorative term used by modernists for the ulama. Khalifa Abdul Hakim published Iqbal and the Mullah in Urdu in 1952. His writings also included a translation of the Bhagavad Gita in Urdu verse. Iqbal and the Mullah was clearly produced at official bidding, and in this, the ulama came across as opportunistic, covetous for material gain, wedded to an anachronistic tradition, indifferent to matters of social welfare, and above all, intent upon creating and perpetuating sectarian divides in the community. They were a threat to both state and religion. For modernists, the proper response to the threat of the mullah was to disentangle Islam from the mullah. These tensions exploded during the anti-Ahmadi agitation in Punjab in early 1953. Religious groups demanded Ahmadis be declared non-Muslim and that Foreign Minister Sir Zafarullah Khan be removed. Riots forced the government to impose martial law in Lahore. Modernists saw this as a proof of the dangerous power of religious politics, mullahism, but the crisis also revealed that the government itself had lost popular legitimacy. A police report complained that even after more than 5 years, Pakistan still had no constitution and leaders had no real contact with the masses. Muslim modernists have seldom spoken in a single voice. Nonetheless, theirs is an Islam that professes to be democratic. It affirms pluralism, and rather than being legalistic, it is anchored in ethical norms, which are best derived from the Islamic foundational texts. If it is not the Islam of the secularists, it is even less that of the ulama. For all their disagreements of their own, the ulama had wanted to reserve a role for themselves in determining that no legislation was repugnant to the teachings of the Islamic foundational texts. The constitution that was finalized in March 1956 gave them no such role. It had significant Islamic content, but it was almost entirely in accord with modernist sensibilities. It declared Pakistan the Islamic Republic, kept the objective resolution as its preamble, required that the president be a Muslim, said no laws should contradict the Quran and Sunnah, and called for institutions for Islamic research. But it did not give the ulama formal control over legislation. Ironically, though it had taken the country nearly 9 years to get its constitution, the first product was drafted in some hurry. In 1954, Governor General Ghulam Muhammad had already dissolved the first Constituent Assembly amid tensions between Bengal and western provinces. The Muslim League had been badly defeated in East Bengal's 1954 provincial elections, and this created anxieties among the military and bureaucratic elite who feared domination by Bengalis and leftist politicians. They also wanted to protect negotiations with the United States over military alliance and aid during the Cold War. The political instability did not end after the Governor General Iskandar Mirza had become the first president of the Republic under the new constitution, with frequent changes of the prime ministers and growing power of the army chief General Ayub Khan. Finally, in October 1958, Mirza declared martial law and abrogated the constitution, ending Pakistan's first experiment with parliamentary democracy. Within weeks, Ayub Khan removed Mirza and became president himself, beginning a long period of military rule. He would remain in office over the next decade. Now, the second section, modernism in the Ayub Khan era. So, Ayub Khan's view of Islam was very much like the modernist politicians he had replaced. During Ayub Khan's rule, Pakistani modernism took strong state support. Ayub saw Islam as a progressive religion, and in May 1959 speech at a Deobandi Madrasa in Sindh, he criticized the ulama for making Islam rigid and anti-progress. It was on military, bureaucratic and judicial officers that he relied for ideas and governance, and even the functioning of the basic democracy that he envisioned for Pakistan depended on them. The president wanted a complete overhaul of the country. So a new constitution came in 1962, introducing a presidential system and controlled democracy. It kept Islamic elements but softened Islamic language compared to the 1956 constitution. For example, it initially dropped references to sovereignty within God's limits, omitted to mention that the Islam that the government was to enable people to live by was the one set out in the Holy Quran and Sunnah, and even changed the country's name to simply the Republic of Pakistan. Such changes to the 1956 constitution were too much for the ulama and the Islamists. Though the Constitution Commission had affirmed that Pakistan was an ideological and not a secular state, conservative critics of the constitution feared that the country was being set precisely on the path to secularism. The notion that modernists were now trying to free their interpretations of Islam from any textual restraint conjured sinister images in religious circles. It did not help that a religious movement known as the Ahlul Quran and much maligned in ulama circles was thought to have influenced the constitution's pointed omission of the Quran and Sunnah as sources of Islamic guidance. This movement is known for rejecting the authority of Hadith, and it was led by Ghulam Ahmad Parvez in Pakistan. From his early years in office, the president was in touch with Parvez. The simplicity of reference to Islam in the 1962 constitution probably reflects the president's own desire to streamline things rather than Parvez's influence. Parvez did provide considerable aggravation to the ulama, who went so far as to formally rebuke his views in a 1962 fatwa that bore over 1,000 signatures. Taking on the ulama was not easy, however. All the Islamic provisions were brought back into the constitution with the First Amendment, enacted less than 2 years after its promulgation. The country's name was the Islamic Republic of Pakistan once again. The president's retreat was not merely a recognition of the ulama's influence but also good politics. With the new constitution, Ayub Khan had decided to enter the political arena. He became a member of the Muslim League. He was elected president of the party the very day the parliament passed the First Amendment to the constitution. Fazlur Rahman. The leading modernist scholar of the era was Fazlur Rahman, who died in 1988. Although he was the son of an early graduate of the Deoband Madrasa, much of Fazlur Rahman's own education took place in westernized or Western institutions of learning. After a year as a visiting professor at the Institute of Islamic Research, he became its director in 1962 and continued in that position till 1968. It has been widely accepted among Sunnis that the Quran, the Sunnah, consensus, ijma, and human reason exercised within particular limits are the four sources of the law. Human reason could take the form of ijtihad to arrive at new legal rulings in the light of the foundational texts, but in the interest of preserving the coherence and integrity of their legal tradition, Sunni scholars came to gradually restrict largely to analogical reasoning. The very positioning of reason at the bottom of the scale suggested its subordinate role in the articulation of norms, and this was problematic for Rahman, as he thought that it had caused intellectual sterility and that God could not have intended that human beings take leave of their reason. Rahman argued that much of what is attributed to the Prophet in the form of hadith does not go back to him but reflects instead the evolving views of the early community. Rahman was not willing to treat even the contents of the sound hadiths as the authoritative collections as an exception to his view of hadith. He argued that the early community had come to model itself for the practice of the Prophet while continuing to elaborate on and to develop that model in light of their changing circumstances. Hadith gave concrete form to this lived tradition which could be glimpsed through it. But Sunni orthodoxy's view was that the Sunnah could only be found in the form of hadith reports, unlike the view of Rahman. For Rahman, even the Quran was not necessarily binding in all its particulars because its teachings were meant to be interpreted by people in light of their changing circumstances, and also because Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself had given expression to divine revelation in terms of how he had understood it in his milieu. Rahman said in his Islamic methodology in history, our earliest generations looked upon the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet not as something static but essentially as something that moves through different social forms and moves creatively. Islam is the name of certain norms and ideals which are to be progressively realized through different social phenomena and setups. The forbidding of riba in Quran has generally been understood by Muslim scholars to extend to all transactions that involve financial interest. Rahman, like other modernists, argued against it, but he said that certain forms of interest may have been permitted and practiced in the time of the Prophet and his companions, and that a common definition of riba as every loan from which some profit accrues may have originated in 10th century lexicographical attempts at offering comprehensive definitions, and that it was only in the 11th century that it found its way into hadith collections. It is clear that Rahman posed a challenge to ulama. Already in 1963, Ethyam al-Haq Thanvi, a prominent Deobandi scholar, had taken issue with Rahman's views on financial interest, denying that the Quran had intended to prohibit it only in its successive forms. But he also went on to castigate Rahman for unorthodox views on the nature of prophethood. Thanvi gave the impression that Rahman saw prophet merely as a superior intellect rather than one receiving revelations from God, and this would have been damning in Pakistani context. But Rahman said that what he was describing in his book were Avicenna's views rather than his own, and there were some other controversies too. Rahman also supported birth control, state regulation of religion, basic democracy, limits on party politics, and even Quranic grounds for press control, as in 1960 Ayub Khan had promulgated his notorious Press and Publications Ordinance, which had drastically curtailed the freedom of the press, aligning closely with Ayub's statist policies. The government had begun by then to look increasingly vulnerable on a variety of fronts. Unrest was growing in East Pakistan, which would later become Bangladesh. There was discontent on the outcome of the 1965 Indo-Pak War, and the Tashkent Agreement 1966 had failed to resolve Kashmir, embarrassing the regime. Food prices were rising and the government's confidence had faded. The ulama alone could not overthrow the regime, but they added to the feeling that it lacked legitimacy. One major issue they focused on was opposition to Fazlur Rahman. In 1966, Rahman published his book Islam, a modernist study of Islamic tradition. The controversy that his 1958 book on the idea of prophecy had generated was as nothing compared to the public outcry on Islam. Rahman's position as the director of this Institute of Islamic Research was no longer tenable, and the government was too weak to try to defend him with any vigor, and he resigned on September 5, 1968, the end of an era. As the situation in Pakistan worsened, with even fears that the country might break apart, Ayub Khan's regime fell in 1969 after about 10 years in power. East Pakistanis had long been unhappy, especially since Jinnah's earlier decision to make Urdu the national language, which felt foreign to Bengali culture. Economic inequality between East and West Pakistan also grew during Ayub's period of industrial development, mostly benefiting the western part of the country. East Pakistan's large Hindu population was viewed suspiciously by officials, and even Muslim Bengalis were often looked down upon by West Pakistanis. In 1966, the Awami League demanded major autonomy through its famous 6 points, including provincial control over taxes and even a separate military for East Pakistan, but these were the demands that were rejected by West Pakistani military. In 1968, the government claimed to uncover a Bengali secession conspiracy backed by India and jailed Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, but the failed trial only increased anti-state feelings in the East. Meanwhile, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto formed the Pakistan People's Party (PPP). Student protests and labor strikes spread, led in East Pakistan by Maulana Bhashani, a Deobandi scholar with socialist ideas. On 26 March 1969, 2.5 million workers struck in West Pakistan, and the army stopped supporting Ayub, forcing him to resign and hand power to General Yahya Khan, who imposed martial law and ended the 1962 constitution. Pakistan's first general elections by adult franchise were held in December 1970. After devastating cyclones that killed about 500,000 people in East Pakistan, anger at poor relief helped the Awami League to get massive success and win 162 of 300 National Assembly seats, all from the East. Bhutto's PPP, campaigning on Islamic socialism, won 81 seats, all from the West. The military feared giving power to the Awami League because of its autonomy plans. Mujib refused to share power with Bhutto. As tensions rose, the army launched a military operation in East Pakistan in March 1971. This led to open rebellion, with the Mukti Bahini fighting back with Indian support. Massacres occurred on both sides and millions fled to India, leading to a short India-Pakistan war. On December 16, 1971, 93,000 Pakistani soldiers surrendered in Dhaka and Bangladesh was created. Death estimates range from 26,000 to 3 million, but the true number was likely very high. What remained was only West Pakistan, where Bhutto became president and then prime minister after the 1973 constitution. Now the third section, the Bhutto and Zia-ul-Haq years. After the 1971 break of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came to power. But his reputation was damaged because many believed he had helped block the transfer of power to the Awami League and hence caused the breakup of country. Also, his idea of Islamic socialism did not sit well with religious groups. A fatwa was issued in 1970 and it condemned socialism of all kinds, and it had carried more than 100 signatures by the ulama. To strengthen his Islamic image, Bhutto included many Islamic clauses in the 1973 constitution and hosted the OIC summit in Lahore in March 1974, attended by major Muslim leaders like King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of the United Arab Emirates, Anwar Sadat of Egypt, Hafiz al-Assad of Syria, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and Yasser Arafat of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it took place in the wake of the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 and the Arab oil embargo against several Western countries for their support of Israel. This boosted Pakistan's image in the Muslim world and helped Bhutto to gain religious legitimacy. That same year, under pressure from religious groups, his government declared Ahmadis non-Muslims through a constitutional amendment. He also created a Ministry of Religious Affairs and made symbolic Islamic gestures while politically moving away from hardline leftists. The modern scholar Fazlur Rahman advised Bhutto. He argued that Islam is not religious versus secular, but a system of moral values covering all life. Hence, the modernists appealed to the ethical sensibilities of Islam. He wanted Islam presented in social and ethical terms, not as old medieval law. He proposed state control over religious education, trained imams, an Islamic university, and an official Dar al-Ifta. But Bhutto's government avoided Islamic reforms suggested by Fazlur Rahman and instead took symbolic steps like making Friday the weekly holiday. Such measures did not satisfy the religious parties, who formed a powerful electoral alliance against it. The official results pointed to a victory for the People's Party, but the opposition alleged widespread rigging and launched a countrywide agitation to dislodge Bhutto and install the system of the Prophet Nizam-e-Mustafa. The unrest in the country led to the imposition of martial law by General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq in July 1977. Bhutto was hanged 2 years later. Zia-ul-Haq stayed in power till 1988, overseeing during those years the most extensive effort the country had yet experienced to Islamize the society and economy. It is tempting to see the Zia-ul-Haq years as marking a sharp decline in the fortunes of Islamic modernism in Pakistan, and that would be a fair assessment, but with two caveats or cautions. First, though the ulama and the Islamists received a good deal of state patronage in the Zia-ul-Haq era, the civil and judicial bureaucracy continued to be staffed by the Western educated people. There was interest-based banking, though with interest-free banks, and Ayyub's 1961 Muslim family laws stayed protected, and many state officials were still Western educated. Second, the modernism was already in retreat under Bhutto. There was some mention of Islamic social justice and related themes in the pages of Islamic studies, but there was little to parallel the sort of modernist discourse witnessed in the Ayyub Khan era. Even intellectuals like Muhammad Hassan Askari moved from earlier leftist and modernist ideas toward traditional Deobandi Islam. Around the time of the fall of Ayyub Khan regime, he had written a short book titled Jadidiyat, Modernism for Madrasa Students, in which he sought to introduce the key moments in the history of Western thought and laid the blame of irreligiosity on unrestrained individualism and the breakdown of religious authority due to Protestantism. He said, the ulama should be on their guard when English-educated people praise the ethical principles of Islam, for these people tend to think of all Islam, even Sufism, as mere ethics. The example of Hassan Askari helps draw our attention to weaknesses in the appeal of modernism even before the era of Bhutto. However, the implications of this example should not be exaggerated, for even under authoritarian rule, there could be significant cultural vibrancy and experimentation. For example, Parveen Shakir, who published 4 collections of poetry between 1977 and 1990, is noted for bringing self-confident feminine voice to her work and for exploring themes relating to female desire. 3 of her collections of poetry were published during the Zia-ul-Haq years, and 2 of them won important prizes, suggests that she was not seen as a threat to any establishment. She was an officer in the civil service and was a member of the higher bureaucracy, and it probably gave her protection. Her example nonetheless shows shows that the cultural sphere, even under authoritarian rule, was more varied than might be suggested. After Zia's death in 1988, Benazir Bhutto became the first woman prime minister in the Muslim world, and it was a matter of great pride for her, and this seemed hopeful for modernism. Sometimes the religio-political leaders adopted unexpected positions, like in early 1965, Maududi had decided to support the candidacy of Fatima Jinnah, and another example is the alliance of Maulana Fazlur Rahman, the leader of Jamiat Ulama Islam, with Bhutto during her second term. Benazir struggled with Islamic legislation left from Zia, like the Sharia ordinance, and was accused of being too Western. The conservative parties dominating the parliament's upper house adopted a Sharia bill of their own. The next government was led by Nawaz Sharif, and that party had helped with the passage of Sharia bill in the Senate, and Nawaz Sharif put it into effect in May 1991. But it did little to change how the country was governed or how the Islamic law was given effect. The government was succeeded by that of Benazir Bhutto again. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan had come to an end in 1989. A seemingly mighty superpower had been brought low by Mujahideen was very empowering for religio-political groups. But the end of the Soviet Union occupation led to a civil war among factions dominated by Afghan warlords, and that continued for several years. And in 1994, the Taliban, students from Deoband Madrasa backgrounds in Pakistan, rose to end the atrocities of the warlords, to restore order and to bring proper Sharia norms to Afghanistan. Pakistan's military and its intelligence agency, ISI, supported Taliban because they were tired of the divided Afghan Mujahideen and wanted strategic depth, meaning Afghanistan could serve as backup territory if India attacked Pakistan. At the same time, the American oil company wanted peace in Afghanistan to build a pipeline to Central Asia. But religious groups supported the Taliban because the movement promised a strict enforcement of Islamic law. By September 1996, the Taliban had captured Kabul. Even before that, they were enforcing very harsh punishments. In February 1995, Bhutto said that although the Taliban locked women indoors, she had come to power through votes. Pakistan's military often controlled Afghan policy more than elected leaders did. Maulana Fazlur Rahman was a strong Taliban supporter and was also the ally of Bhutto's government. This shows that conservative voices had become prominent in Pakistan during the 1990s. When Nawaz Sharif became prime minister again, this trend continued. The military overthrew his government in 1999. Under General Pervez Musharraf, especially after September 11, 2001, there were serious efforts to revive Islamic modernism. And the final section, the years of enlightened moderation. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, Pakistan faced huge pressures when General Pervez Musharraf suddenly shifted from supporting the Taliban to becoming a US ally in the war on terror. This angered Islamist groups inside Pakistan and led to a neo-Taliban insurgency in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Militants carried out suicide bombings and attacks that badly hurt Pakistan's stability and economy and society. Yet 2001 also gave Musharraf a chance to revive Islamic modernism. In 1991, the Federal Shariat Court had determined that all forms of financial interest constituted the riba were prohibited by the Quran. The Shariat Appellate Bench had upheld that judgment in 1999, requiring the government to end all interest-based transactions by July 2002. Just before the deadline, the court reversed this and sent the issue back. Musharraf also tried to regulate madrasa and in 2006 passed the Protection of Women Act, which softened some harsh parts of Zia's 1979 Hudud laws. General Pervez Musharraf's regime used the term enlightened moderation for its modernist initiatives. In a June 2004 Washington Post article, Musharraf said this meant that Muslims should reject extremism and focus on economic progress, while the West should solve political conflict fairly and help poor Muslim countries develop. There was some talk as well of making enlightened moderation a part of the social studies curriculum in the country's public schools, but this didn't survive the fall of Musharraf's regime in 2008. One religious scholar whose ideas partly matched Musharraf's policies was Javed Ahmad Ghamidi. Then he was a commentator on the Quran in Lahore and had once been a member of Jamaat-e-Islami but had left that organization, and he was an informal student of Amin Ahsan Islahi. Some, but not all, of Ghamdi's ideas suited to the regime's interest. Ghamdi argued that religious scholars should stay out of politics and that creating an Islamic state is not a religious duty. He believed that state could only require Muslims to believe in God and the Prophet, pray and pay zakat, and not force fasting, pilgrimage or jihad. Only a government can declare jihad. He was also critical of Ziaul Haq Hudud ordinances. These views helped Musharraf fight militants and reform laws, and Ghamdi was placed on the Council of Islamic Ideology. After 2002, new TV channels increased his influence. Still, he disagreed with the regime on issues like financial interest, which he believed was always forbidden. Some militants attacked his circle, one of his associates was killed, and Ghamdi was forced to flee to Malaysia in 2010. Two other intellectuals are also discussed to further highlight the ambiguities as well as the constraints of modernism of that time. The first is Muhammad Shakil Oj, who was professor and dean of Faculty of Islamic Studies at the University of Karachi when he was assassinated in 2014. He believed only the Quran should decide religious law, and he argued that a philosophical ijtihad to reorient the entire juridical tradition had become necessary in modern times instead of just legal jihad to address specific needs. He tried to show that many non-Muslims could even be considered Muslims in particular contexts and that Quranic teachings could serve as the basis of mutual coexistence in today's world. He critiqued the practice of underage marriage and also argued for for the permissibility of a Muslim woman's marriage to a Jewish or Christian man. He argued that a woman can travel alone and that her testimony should be considered equal to that of a man, except in very specific cases mentioned in the Quran. Yet, rather like Gandhi, there were severe limits to O's desire to rethink traditional norms. He defended polygamy and opposed expanding women's divorce rights, and rejected alimony beyond the Quranic waiting period. His mixed views angered both conservatives and others. His views show that how traditionalist views can stand alongside progressive ones at the same time. The second example is that of Muhammad Khalid Masood, an Islamic law scholar and former chair of the Council Islamic Ideology under Musharraf. Influenced by the classical jurist Al-Shatibi, Masood emphasized the Maqasid al-Sharia, or five kulliyat of Islamic law, protecting life, religion, property, family, and intellect. To Shatibi, the Sharia's broad concern with the good maslaha of the believers was classifiable into three categories: necessities, zaruriyat, needs, hajiyat, and things conducive to promoting general human welfare, tahsiniyat. So Masood argued that many traditional rules were cultural, not essential, and could change. He said women do not need a male guardian for marriage and supported giving women full divorce rights, and that face wheeling was cultural. But conservatives criticized him strongly. Pakistani modernists have usually presented Islam as having strong ethical sensibilities, and this was prominent in, for example, the Objectives Resolution and in the book of Fazlur Rahman, Major Themes of the Quran. Muhammad Hassan Askari warned the ulama not to be taken in by it. Javed Ahmad Ghamidi too kept developing his ideas abroad, including criticism of Pakistan blasphemy laws. Inside Pakistan, Shakil Oz also emphasized Islam's ethical spirit and even dedicated a book to his father for teaching love towards all humans and even animals. Muhammad Khalid Masood always based legal reform on the broad ethical goals of the Sharia. However, the decline of modernism in Pakistan was not caused only by Zia al-Haq's Islamization and global Islamic revivalism. A major problem was that modernist ideas often came from rulers with weak legitimacy or intellectuals close to them. Khalifa Abdul Hakim was linked to Ghulam Muhammad, the Governor General known for dissolving the first Constituent Assembly. Opposition to Fazlur Rahman was intensified because he worked with an authoritarian regime. Similarly, Islamist leaders Qazi Hussain Ahmad later called Musharraf's enlightened moderation a threat to Pakistan's identity and Islamic values. Authoritarian rule also limited modernist thought in other ways. One example is the weakening of the ideal of social justice, which modernists had once strongly supported during Cold War due to the fear of communism. Governments also suppressed trade unions, and the Zia regime and later privatization in the 1990s weakened unions further. Modernists also failed to reassure non-Muslim minorities. They often showed contempt towards the ulama, and given the ulama's influence in society, this has not served the modernists well. The ulama, even the traditionalists among them, are a diverse lot with considerable flexibility in their ranks and substantial ability to adapt to change, and modernists often failed to recognize this, which prevented long-term alliances and weakened modernism's position in Pakistan. And that is the end of this video. And to understand this conflict of modern state and Islam or Islamic State, you can watch my videos on the impossible state, which will make a lot of things clear about that topic. And in the next video, I will discuss the relationship of Pakistan and the ulama and how they have challenged each other on different times throughout the history of Pakistan.